Well, I'm Monessa Overby, Rochester Franciscan. And I worked with Dan Corcoran in ministry for 20-some years, and also walked with him during the last years of his life, which was a privilege. He became almost the opposite of the person that I had known all those years. This guy who was up and running and, handling everything, to having to be totally cared for. So it's knowing him in two different ways.
So before we go any further, I just want to say a couple of things just to get us started. So I want to welcome everybody here to our Catholic Worker Roundtable. We have these pretty much monthly, except maybe in the summer. And the idea behind them is Peter Moore, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, said, "You tell me what's on your mind, I'll tell you what's on my mind, and we'll both have more on our minds." So, and I was working on organizing roundtable discussions for this kind of latter part of 2024, and I really got thinking about the fact that Monessa has now retired back to Assisi Heights in Rochester. She'd been in California for
35
years. And so she's moved back, and it's been wonderful to be able to go visit her more regularly. And just the fact that she's so familiar with Father Corcoran, I'm certainly, knew him, but not in the same way. And I just really wanted an opportunity for a first-hand account of someone who really worked side by side with him, and kind of explain, so as you know, we named a house after him, and that I, pushed for that, but I know that it was the right thing to do. And so, so today, Monessa's going to just share her memories and reflections on working with him, and kind of connecting where he stood with the Catholic Worker Movement, and the value of naming our house after him. Because I will say, oftentimes at the Newman Center, we might have someone spending the night, we might have someone showing up for soup, and Dan was just, wonderful about providing for them. And Monessa would say, "Dan, this is not a Catholic worker house."
To no avail. I never won.
So when it was time to name our house, I decided that, he finally gets his Catholic worker house.
Well, having said that, Mary, I was reading what you wrote. I hope I can find it easily. First of all, Father Dan's niece, Colleen Corcoran Balbusti, who lives in Connecticut, heard from a different relative here that she saw this notice in the paper about today. And so she called Colleen to tell her, and Colleen called me and said, "Could I write a couple of, I won't do more than 2 pages." Which she did do, but she also sent some pictures, and that's what I'm going to try. I just wanted to try to find this, oh dear, because you just prompted me. It was Mary's address, not address, your interview for the paper when you named the Dan Corcoran house. I won't spend a lot of time looking for it, but I hope I can find it. Because really, when you read this, you'll know how Dan impacted one person, but many persons. So Mary Farrell explains why the house was named after Father Corcoran. The effect Dan had on me was also true for many people in this area. Dan stood out among many as one who performed the works of mercy. With him, there was always an extra bowl of soup for whoever came to his door, a bed or a couch for someone to spend the night on, a listening ear and heart for someone with troubles. Dan was a man always ahead of his time. His unceasing voice and work for peace and justice led many of us into life-changing choices and commitments. And that just says it so well.
I said that.
You said that. You said that.
Turn the camera around it.
Yeah, you said that. Well, I've thought all along, Mary, you ought to be doing this, and I'm sure and hope you do it. But that was succinctly really, really said, and could be repeated by many people who came in contact with Dan. I will tell you, when I was being encouraged to go to work for Dan in Austin, our, what we called Mother General at that time, called me and said, well, first of all, I'd been getting phone calls from the associate pastor there and from one of our sisters. Monessa, you've got to come. You've got to come. You're the one. And I said, I only know this man by his reputation, and that is scary. Right? Sister Shirley also worked with him, so she knows what I'm talking about. Anyway, then I get this call from the Mother Superior. Father Corcoran wants you to come to St. Edward's in Austin. He didn't know me from Adam or Eve. But he was hearing from these other folks. So I said to Mother, okay, may I go over and interview? They wanted to interview me. I said, may I go over? Yes, sister, but I would like you to go there. At that point, we were making our own choices of where we were involved in ministry. So I went over, and here is in the dining room, Father Dan had this huge circle, a table. There was room for everybody. But around that were all kinds of other people. The room was packed. Well, bottom line was, after we got into the interview, and I asked some of my questions, someone said, who's interviewing whom here? And then someone else said, maybe we ought to rethink this again, and because they want me to do two jobs. I was to be a pastoral ministry and the principal of the school. Well, I had just been doing those two jobs in Lake City, and I knew it was too much. So they decided they needed to figure out which one was I interested in, which one would I take. I said, pastoral ministry, because that's the future. And so that's how I wound up working with Dan Corcoran. And I will tell you that to be able to work with him took an argument. After working long, long hours one day and night, he wanted me to go to the hospital. I don't remember if it was to do rounds or just to visit someone, and I just said, I'm just too tired. And he never took that. You're never too tired. Because he could take cat naps and be ready to go. And so I burst out with how I felt about it, and I decided afterwards, well, I can work with him. If I can stand up to him, I can work with him. So that was the beginning of a long ministry. And I will say, Dan would not sit still for us sitting here and talking about him. He would have his shoes off and he'd be fidgeting. Those were very characteristic, right, Shirley? He probably wants to get off, go to the hospital, or go to the jail, or go to someone who's in stress. He was like nonstop until he needed a nap. And then he was gone for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and up and running again. So when I thought about today, I thought, Mary was inviting me to talk about his commitment to the poor, his social justice activism. And I just think for any of us to understand someone, you kind of look at where they came from, his childhood. And so some interesting things about his childhood. His father was a science teacher. He was always proud of his dad. He had gone to, oh shucks, now I forgot the name of the college. Anyway, he became a science teacher and very interested in astronomy. He died when Dan was 10. And he would tell the story that was so important to him is he and his dad would lay out on the cellar, you know, the cellar, where you could go down in the cellar and keep it, yeah. And they'd lay on that, and his dad would teach him about the stars. That was such a significant memory for him. His mother, on the other hand, was adventurous. They were both from Little Hoka, but she was a hardy girl, and Hardy, maybe some of you know, but it was an activism, a women's activism group. And she was young, but she was on the train to San Francisco and back, and part of this activism group out there. And I remember him saying once, the conductor said because it was the time when the 1906 earthquake hit San Francisco. And so these hardy girls were given free train tickets. And so she told the conductor she wanted to go to New York City. She wanted to go to New York City before she came back to Brownsville. So Dan, and the conductor would say to her, is that you again, Irish? Anyway, he loved to tell that little story. So those are the two parents. His mother was not happy in a rural life. But when her husband died, there were 5 children. The 3 girls and 2 boys. And so when he was gone, somehow Catholic education seemed important, but I'm wondering about that motive, because the kids kind of all lived in different places with families in order to go to school. Dan would describe some of the settings they were in. Sometimes we were with families, but sometimes they were in some, to me the image was just a small little room, where there'd be 2 of them, and they oftentimes didn't have food. So that poverty was just his experience right from the beginning. And his mother, who somehow had to deal with the fact that she was unhappy in that setting. Like she would have preferred New York or San Francisco. At any rate, I often thought, well, his activism started with her, maybe. So, we were talking earlier about the youngest girl was Marcy. And she actually moved in with another family and never did come back to be raised with the other kids. So it took some years before they were really reconnected. But anyway, that's something about his background that I think impacted and influenced where he went from there, because he became a person that was always there for the underdog, was always there for his belief that we really are all one and that we need to be caring for those who are most in need. So when I think about Dan, those of you that knew him, he was a character. He was a character, right? He was unpredictable, and he was on the go, as if he needed to make the world change in a short life. So well, one of the ways that I think I can tell you, the best way to understand Dan is storytelling. And anybody that knew him has stories to tell. So I think of him as a character, and then I also think of him as a man of character, because he was very convicted. He had his values, and he was consistent in living out those values. Mary had said, tell stories. That is the best way. However, as I got reflecting on this, I had all other kinds of philosophical thoughts. When Dan entered the seminary, he was young, like 17, very bright. And his ministry during the seminary was to the poor in the St. Paul area. Then when he was ordained, he was sent to Queen of Angels Parish in Austin, because it was a time when the workers at Hormel were on strike, and there were scabs coming in to replace them. And so it impacted the whole community. And he was sent in a negotiator role, this young guy. But that really said a lot about how he did the rest of his life. There was always negotiating in some way to help someone. When his only brother, Mark, died at age 44, he became a surrogate father to the 5 girls and 1 boy in that family. And Colleen, who wrote those pages to me, said that he was always there for us throughout our lives. And she tells a lot of stories about ways that he took them off to California for a vacation, or took them out to have something to eat that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and how their mother did not appreciate him.
So these were nieces and nephews?
Right.
Okay.
And Colleen went to Africa with the Peace Corps, and her mother called Peace Corps headquarters and said she would be a terrible volunteer. And she would blame Dan for influence her into this, I don't know what she thought, communist organization or whatever. So anyway, yeah. So when I first went to work with Dan, what I knew of his reputation and what I saw was he was always opening people, or trying to open people to a larger picture. To think beyond their own little turf And so this was pre-Vatican, but they had what they called pastoral weekends. And so the likes of Dan Berrigan came to speak to that community. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Death and Dying. Those were the two that I remember most. And people came from all over for these pastoral weekends. It was a lot about getting to know the rest of the parishioners, getting to know others, thinking outside the box. And that was his always, anything that he would plan or instigate, that's the better word, instigate. He would instigate these things and then he'd turn them over. He was amazing in that way. But when I went to work there, I was a pastoral, he wanted to call me associate pastor. And I said, oh, that will never fly. I think, never fly with the bishop, will never fly with the people. And so he coined the term pastoral associate, which we use today, a lot of places. But this is how I got part of my training there. A 10-day nonviolence training in Indiana somewhere. Then I'm leafleting on the corner of Sandstone, Minnesota, and I don't even remember what we were leafleting about, but we were on the corner handing out.
The prisoners? Was that where the prison is?
That's a federal prison.
But no death penalty executions.
Oh, that's probably what it was. Yeah, you're right. And then we're crossing the line. Mary, I think you were with us at the Omaha Nuclear Center.
I was too.
You were too.
Yeah.
And I got arrested.
Yeah, I did too. Got our FBI record.
Yep.
What year was that about?
80, in the 80s?
It was in the 80s.
It was in the 80s, yeah. And then 4 of us were driving nonstop to D.C. for a Vietnam protest. So, as I said, he was an instigator, and I obviously didn't think that was what I'd be doing as a pastoral counselor. But I was ready for it. I think I really was ready. So I got some pretty intense training along the way. And for some reason, we were a good team. And we were very opposite. He took risks and I wanted to be safe. A lot of others. No. A lot of my training was doing inner work. He was very much dealing with the larger world. And somehow it worked. Might have been because I was ready to hear it, or ready to expand my own life. And so I think it's one of the things he did for me.
What, could I?
Yes.
Knowing Monessa at that time, or what you just said, when you said you're not a risk taker, one of the things that I remember is the people that Monessa worked with, she just helped risk learning going into that world. And so I think, however you'd say it, yeah, that's where you connected through the risks, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Yeah, that is risky.
Yeah.
I want to just comment about that, because that meant a lot to me, that you two were so different. But you both have these amazing gifts that really impacted and benefited our own spiritual and personal growth. Because, you know, Dan was kind of focused on social justice and really getting us involved in those issues. And then Monessa would have these very small personal growth groups, we called them.
Yeah.
And she really got us working on our inner selves, and it was a beautiful combination and a very holistic thing to be a part
Yeah.
of that Newman Center.
And you were a college student then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's pretty cool that college students are doing all that inner work. Yeah.
I'm glad you said that, because, this is a round table discussion. I didn't know how that worked, so I don't need to do all the talking, so please. Thank you. Well, because I first worked with Dan in Austin, is when I would see the ways in which his thinking was expansive. And there were little things that he did, like there were always bags of groceries in the kitchen for anyone that came by who had bad luck and needed something. But he also would give out gas cards, or however he did that, I don't know, but at one point he decided that he was being scammed about this because they really weren't using this for gas. So he started going with them then and filling the gas tank. So he wasn't naive. Dan would give the shirt off his back. And the parishioners sometimes tried to dress him. One man came up to him one day and put some money in his hand, and he said, "Buy a new coat." And when he left St. Edward's, they gave him a car and a wardrobe. Of that wardrobe, I only ever saw him wear one thing. I don't know where the rest went. So in the culture here in this country, Dan was definitely counterculture. He was, it was if he wasn't surrounded by this culture and taken in by it. And so it was especially obvious when he moved to Winona. He didn't have an associate living with him, and he had that little house next to the Newman Center. And so first thing he did was put in a wood stove, and also in the Newman Center. Well, that meant you have to have wood. So he'd be out getting wood and putting it in the back of the car to bring it to Winona. That old, anyone remember that old car with it was a maroon color? I think he even took the seats out of the back. And one time, somehow I got involved, and he had also another kind of trailer on the back. And so the whole thing was loaded down with wood. And he wanted to stop at the Y, because he would go there for his showers and to do his laundry, to save water. Well, then the car wouldn't turn over, so before he left, we got help, but he still took off to the Y. Anyway, I don't know.
Share about how he would drive with you, but he didn't. They'd be going down the highway, but he didn't want to stop the car because that would take up too much time or whatever. So he'd be in the driver's seat, and you were in the passenger seat, and somehow he would get you. He'd have to move over while you also moved over and took the driver.
Oh my goodness.
Well, that happened with one of our sisters. She was in the front seat and she didn't drive. he goes over the top and says, "You take over," and she says, "I don't drive." Yeah. Oh my, character. He was a character. You know, saving water was really important to him, just like having wood stoves. And students, we would always have about a yearly spaghetti dinner. And Dan would be the first one up. This was always true. Any meal, he's the first one up. He's finished and he's on to the next thing. But he's on to clean up. So students would come and say, "Can you do anything about that dirty water he's washing these dishes in?" Now for Dan, that was just spaghetti sauce. So, yeah. Those were the kind of, quirky things about him.
And that was, I think, the first time I ever had spaghetti sauce, or spaghetti with sauce made out of peanuts.
Oh yes, that's right.
We weren't using meat, we were using, there was that whole Francis Moore LaPay thing.
Oh,
that
yeah.
was
That's right.
Like whole peanuts?
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, what was it, like whole peanuts instead of a meatball?
Well, it was
No, it was, they were
Ground up,
ground.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Mhm.
Interesting.
like walnut.
Eat lower in the food chain.
It worked. It worked. You got your protein. And you know, he had this, I don't know how he managed this, but the very first day that he was assigned there, he went over and somehow he got the Crisco Commons for Sunday masses. Then the next thing, he somehow, whoever he was talking to there at the college, he was able to use their freezer in the kitchen. So when it was berry season, he would grab anybody that would go and pick berries, usually blackberries, and freeze them. They'd be in these 5-gallon ice cream pails, and he'd have those frozen so we could use them some way for the students. And then apples. Making apple cider became, I'll tell you what, the Redding farm had a press, so students would go out, they would be picking apples off the trees, and Dan would picking them off the ground, no matter how they looked. We don't waste any. So then we'd have these 5 gallons that, again, we'd use for these big spaghetti dinners. That was the big thing. I guess it was actually a fundraiser. I don't know if it ever amounted to anything there. So then he learned he wanted to grow his own vegetables. And so he learned about these French intensive gardens.
Raised beds.
Raised beds, yeah, but they were French intensive when he learned about these, he called them. So, but I don't think that was ever successful, because there was no room for one thing.
Where was that? I don't remember.
It was by the parking lot.
Did Milo Billman have anything to do with that? Milo Billman, who was a street minister?
Oh yeah, Milo, I'd forgotten, yes. That's right. I remember too, we all remember this, one of the professors asked him to take care of his cat while they were gone,
Morello?
Morello. And then when he got back, he didn't want the cat back. So it was a disaster, but Dan kept the cat. It was a disaster. Yeah, when you mentioned about his, well, he always was a speed driver actually, until the word came out that if you drive at 55 miles per hour, that will help the emissions, control emissions. So he actually went down to driving 55 miles an hour, which was quite a change. Now in Winona, mostly he went by bike around town. Just the bike was his way. I can see, you took a wonderful picture of him, Mary, coming out of the, yeah, so.
I'm going to just share this because when you mentioned the bike, it reminds me of, so when I, after I think it was the end of the school year, and I had, was going back up north to be at my parents' this summer, but the dorms had closed or whatever, and I needed another night, so I stayed one night at the Newman Center. And I was taking the train the next day up to Duluth. And so the train left really early. I got up at like 4 o'clock in the morning to walk to the train. So it was dark out. I just had a bag and a knapsack or something. Anyway, I'm walking to the train, and all of a sudden this strange thing happens. This car starts approaching me, and these two guys get out, and I'm thinking, something's going to happen. And something did. They came towards me, and they robbed me. It was basically kind of a hand up. I knew they were, so I just let go of my bag, and then I kept walking, and then I turned around and I didn't see him, and I ran to the train station, because the train station wasn't that far from the Newman Center. And so I called Dan, and I called the police, and Dan was there first, on his bicycle.
And what's the rest of that
And
story?
the rest of the story is then, so Dan was there, and the police came. We all get in the police car, and they think they found this person. And so we drive a couple blocks, and they asked this kid, this student, I think he was, to come out of the house. And I looked at him, and I said, "Yeah, that's him." Debbie, you teased me about this, but I recognized the necklace he had on around his neck, those details. So then I got back. Again, the train was late, so I got on the train and went north. And then I get a phone call. I'm home with my parents. I get a phone call, and it's Dan. He's taken in this kid. Yeah, he paid his bail or whatever. And,
Yeah.
That's a good story.
The other story about the student who, he wasn't robbed, but he was attacked. This was during the night also, Steve. And so he called Dan, and Dan was there, and took him to the hospital, and so.
That's the thing about Dan. He was there. He showed up. He showed up when you asked him to come.
He was there.
Yeah.
That's why he needed catnaps, because he was available 24/7. Let's see, there was another thing. I was trying to think of another example of that. Well, I've forgotten it now, but yeah, he was there when we called him. That was true in Austin. It was true, I think, his whole life in the ministry. I mean, his family have a lot to say about that, how he was always there for them.
I should say, we should go till 4:30. So,
This thing about ownership, that was not in Dan's DNA. It was like, all is for all, and everybody shares. And so he really, I think that really impacted, like, who is most in need? What do they need? Do they need a bed? Do they need a couch? Do they need a meal? Do they,
or the car, he would let us borrow the car. He would let us borrow his car.
Yes.
Because we didn't let him, just didn't have cars.
Oh, yeah, no sense of this is mine, which is really a philosophy of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker. Yeah. His motivation was never about himself. He was not someone that climbed any ladder and wanted any kudos or You know, would you say that's true? Yeah. He he would hobnob with someone like a Senator Hubert Humphrey, trying to get him to pass a bill or and then he could also visit with a woman. For years he visited with a woman in jail, in prison, because she had performed abortions. And that's a very interesting story. He was very, very young, I'll say. And when some of these being housed out in different places, he was in this home, and he was always, the woman was always needing him to bring a tea kettle of hot water upstairs. And so he's carrying these tea kettles, hot water up there. He didn't know what it was for. And then she was put in prison because she had been performing abortions. But he visited her, I'd say, well, in the 80s maybe, he was still visiting her in prison, even though he then knew what the deal was. Dan was really ahead of Vatican II in many ways. And some of that happened because he was made the new pastor at a new parish, St. Edward's in Austin, and the church wasn't built yet. And so they had Mass in a bank. And so it was just common sense to him, this way he'd tell it, that the altar would face the people, not have his back to them. That they would receive communion in the hand. That was what he thought was reasonable. And Vatican II changed a lot for everybody, but yeah, so many things. I think of liturgies at St. Edward's that were so dynamic because Dan had an informality, and I think that was when students came who were used to a formal setting and a formal, you can talk about this more than I can, Mary.
Well, I remember going to Mass one day, he said, can you lecture? And I'd never lectured before. He just, expected me to get up there and read the scripture, but he wouldn't take no for an answer, so.
But what was good about that, I think, is he didn't try to change you, really. He just tried to invite you. And in the end, what happened is you've got people in leadership roles. And that was he had a knack for that. It was amazing to me. My job at the parish that had been divided into 21 neighborhood church groups. And so my job was to develop leadership in those groups. And when I watched Dan, he hardly said anything when parish councils met, or he let the people do it. And I've thought, he would be such a great listener right now for the synod process, because he always focused on involving the laity. The laity ran the church, right from the architect to the builder of that church, to how the ministry was done in the bishop at one point wanted him to start paying back on the debt. What Dan did was he hired 8 new staff because he really believed for service to that parish. So he wasn't someone who was intimidated by superiors or would go along just to go along. And somehow his personality was such that he got by with it, right?
His saying was, it's much easier to say I'm sorry than to ask. I'm going to get a no. Yeah. Say I'm sorry.
When I said he was a character, I think maybe that's part of it.
What year did he come to the Newman Center in Winona?
1976, 5 or 6. Yeah.
And when were you in college here?
I came to Winona State 77 to 81.
In some ways, I could describe Dan as non-threatening. In other ways, I mean, my office was across from his, and sometimes I would hear him on the phone just creaming someone out. Oh my gosh. And then he'd come out of his office like nothing had happened. So he didn't hang on to, and if people disagreed with him, they disagreed with him. You know, at least he knew where they stood. That was true in the parish with a lot of things, you know, like the Vietnam War, for instance. But people loved him. People loved him because they admired and respected him. He was a man of integrity, and people really responded to that. So the parish, as I said, was run by the parishioners. They took charge of things, and so many wonderful things happened there, life-giving. And he brought that to the Newman Center too, I think. Because, well, when he went there and I went there soon after that to study, actually, little did I know I would also have a part-time job in pastoral ministry. But not a job, it was volunteer. He kind of brought that same attitude of, it's your ministry, it's your Newman Center. It was one of his gifts, I think. I was thinking of someone with mental illness or isolation. Dan was there. And I think about this one student who's had a diagnosis of bipolar. And he came by the Newman Center one day outside. Dan was out doing something, and he attacked Dan. He was in a manic episode, and he attacked Dan, who had been his stability. That didn't change things for Dan. He continued to be his support. Yeah. I think when I was saying he was respected, no, he was, his beliefs and his values never wavered. That's why he would come up against people many times. And being around him was always a challenge for me. For that reason, besides how he operated. He lived the Franciscan charism. We name our charism as a compassionate presence. And he lived that in his own style of what compassion meant. No, I might be hugging someone, and he might be shaking their hand this way. He had a way of shaking hands that unusual. I think he lived by the gospel of Jesus, Dorothy Day, Francis of Assisi. I really think those were models for him and mentors, and he really lived by that. You know, he loved the church and he loved his priesthood. But that didn't mean he didn't call out what he did not believe in. And he would say what he had to say, and he didn't care, he didn't think about it. I don't think he really gave a thought to, well, how's the bishop going to react to this? How are my brother priests going to react to this? You know, that was not anything he thought about. And I think, and again, Shirley, you might be able to speak to this, but my sense was his brother priest didn't quite know what to do with him.
Sister Shirley has a brother who's a priest.
Father Don Schumann.
What's that?
I mean, he was the pastor when I taught that.
But I think they admired him.
Mm-hmm.
Where I saw that was at his funeral. And some of the comments that the priest made, they admired him, though they didn't know what to make of him. That's a good place to be, I think.
Danny. That's what they called him, Danny.
Danny, yeah, Danny.
What year did he pass?
What year? 1975. No, 85.
What year did he go?
Where am I?
Did he
Wait,
pass
hang on a
away?
minute, hang on a minute. 95. He was 77, yeah.
Are you going to talk about when he got sick and came to live with you?
About what?
Are you going to talk about when he got sick and then came to live with you?
Yes. Let's see where to go with that, where to start with that.
Well, you can follow your thing, but I want to make sure you talk about that.
When I was looking for a job, it's a long story, but I wound up with this phone call from the Betty Ford Center, and I wound up going there to work. So Dan decided that he would go out to California and live with his niece, who lived about an hour away. That's Donna Corcoran. And that's what happened. But
So, well, Dan had retired.
Dan was,
He'd retired from Newman by that time.
oh yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And his dementia was beginning to show even before he retired. So anyway, that's what he decided to do. And he drove, no, Steve Oley drove his car. I'm not sure if he drove or not. My brother and my nephew drove me out to California. I have to think this through, it's so
Yeah.
complicated, but at any rate, the bottom line was, after he'd been there about a year, it was not a good setting because he was very isolated. His niece and her husband worked all day long, and he was alone a lot. And his family made the decision he should come to St. Anne's, which he did. And one day, our sister Yvonne was coming from Rochester, and she saw him at Stockton Hill. And he had walked to Stockton Hill. He was going to California. So Steve Oley, who was, like Mary, very impacted by Dan, said, I will give a year of my life to care for him. And he did. 15 months he cared for him. but they both came to California. And initially, we lived in the same complex, and I was the backup for Steve. But there were times when Dan would roll the car out of the garage, and Steve started sleeping in front of the door because Dan was going to come over and see me. So, situation there got worse, and we decided the three of us would move together. And again, I was still working, so I was the backup. And Steve did a tremendous ministry in caring for Dan. He was just awesome. But things got worse, and Steve was going to leave. And so we found this little home run by a Filipino couple, but it was a place for caring. There were only a few beds, and those folks loved him and they cared for him. And he was not speaking any longer. And so when the inspectors came about their licensing, they said, no, he would not call out if he needed help, so he needs more care. They wanted to hide him and take him to another house. But the family decided, no, that wouldn't be fair to them. And so then he went into not assisted, but
Skilled nursing.
skilled care. And yeah, he had the last 2 weeks of his life were sad because he had run out of money, and so they moved him to what I called just, well, not good care. And he died within 2 weeks, which was a blessing. So, is that what you wanted me to talk about?
Great story. Part of the story. Well, I was going to add too, then when Dan died then, well, when we named the house after him, he was in California at the time, and I went out to California because I wanted him to tell him, even though I knew that his memory was what it was. But I remember standing next to him, he's lying in bed, and I told him, and I could tell just by his eyes or just some kind of movement that he heard what I had to say. But I really needed to do that in person and tell him. And then when he passed away, I said, I don't want him to go on the ground until he's been to the Dan Corcoran House. So we brought his body to the Dan Corcoran House, and we waked him in the living room over there. What's that?
From California?
No. Well, because he was going to be buried here in Minnesota. So they were going to bring the body back anyway. So, yeah, he was able to.
Where is he buried, Mary?
Hoka.
Okay, where's his hotel?
Yeah.
Actually, he had the funeral in Austin, which is a packed church. Then he came to the Catholic Worker house. And then he went to Hoka, where they had another service.
You're only supposed to open the casket once or something, so he.
Oh my God.
It sounds just like Dan's life, though, right?
Well, either that or Mary had been well trained to make it happen. Make it happen. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd say in general, Dan's life was always prompted by his convictions and his values. I said that earlier. And for him, what he sees as a need is how he served. And he didn't count the cost on himself, and he didn't see obstacles. You know, He didn't consider a lot of the things that I would consider before acting. So, what would you call him? There's a word for that, I think. I don't know what it is. But if he saw an injustice that needed to be confronted, he had a personal call in himself to do something. And that just motivated him. That was his MO.
Monessa, there's a hesitancy in me to share this, and yet it fits so much. When I went to the Newman Center, I don't know if I was waiting for you and you were busy, and I just kind of moseyed over to Dan's door. And on his door had the definition of diplomacy. Do you remember that?
I don't.
Oh my God. And I remember it to this day. Diplomacy, or I don't know if it's diplomacy. Telling someone to go to H and having them look forward to the trip.
No wonder you remember that. Oh, wow, that sounds like him. Oh, gosh. Well, others of you may have stories also.
One thing I just was going to say real quick is just that on tax day, I remember he would fast on tax day. Because, he opposed taxes going for certain things, especially war. And so, and I know he paid his taxes, but he wanted to also fast because he did feel like he didn't agree with how his tax money was being spent.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've never met Dan. I did spend some time at the Newman Center to a few potlucks that they have there. But as you describe him, I was just curious, would you describe him as gregarious?
No.
Because it sounds like the way he operated,
Yeah.
he would almost have to be a person people sort of thing. I mean, really out there being able to talk with anybody and everybody.
He operated in a gregarious way out there.
Okay.
But-
He was a quiet man otherwise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you call him an introvert?
Pardon me?
Would you call him an introvert?
Well, he certainly fought that part of himself.
But I think he was.
He was, but he really made himself be out there. And if you remember, he had a way when he met people. I don't mean, well, anyone. He would. I never worked with him on this English talk, but I could have. He would approach this way, sort of,
Yeah.
kind of
Heart forward.
moving himself forward, but then shaking hands with. I'm not quite sure how he did that. I just, but it was very consistent.
And then Monessa, when he left, the same thing. When he left, like parties or anything like that, or meetings, when he got up, it was time for him to go, he decided, he back out.
Will you be touching?
No, he just
that
keeps
motion.
whatever that was.
At some level, there was a piece of him that was shy.
He's socially awkward, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, not. I haven't used that word, but I've thought it, and so it's interesting you bring up the word gregarious because it'd just be like the opposite of this, but it's what was called for in terms of his serving. And so I never had a sense that he made himself do this. it was just, he had these ingrained values of how to be in the life, how to be in the world, how to live life in this culture as he saw it. So, you know, it was kind of, you think about this, it's admirable to be so certain of this is what I believe, this is what is true for me, and go for it.
You know, one of the things that, so you told 3 stories, and I can only think of 2 of the examples, but one of them Mary told was about the young man who robbed her, and then Dan went and bailed him out, and he stayed at the home. And then the other story you told was of the woman who was imprisoned for abortions, which I'm sure he didn't agree with. But in both, and you told a third story too, but I can't think of it now, but I thought it reminded me, I was able to go see Helen Prashant when she spoke at her Turbo. And she, for those of you who don't know her, she worked with death row inmates. And one of the things there was a movie made about Dead Man Walking, was that it? But one of the things she said that has stayed with me forever, and I think somehow Dan knew this, was she said, all of us have done something we're ashamed of in our lives. And so do we want to be judged by that thing? Is that our whole being? No, it's one thing that we did. Same with somebody on death row. And Dan was able to, this young man who robbed Mary somehow needed some spiritual help. And he was there. Same with the woman he visited in prison. He lived that out.
He did.
Seems like.
He did.
It's admirable.
Very.
Because that's hard to do. Very hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah. There was nothing in him that would judge the person as this is who they are. They're no good. He saw good.
When I was hearing Ibrahim talk, Dan had an appeal to people, like, because his niece Sharon lived at Wiskoy, which was, you know, a rural commune community. And I always felt like he really reached out to, because there were a lot of folks there that were probably former Catholics.
Yep.
You know, but he seemed to have that ability to kind of connect with folks.
Well, he loved the whole idea of Wiskoy.
Yeah.
And he was very supportive right from the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, his relative was very active. It was by his in-law. It's probably the kind of setting that Dan would have loved to live in.
His values sure reflect a lot of money.
So one contribution I can make to this is partly, you know, memory from that period, and then studying this. The 60s cultural activism was my area of teaching and research as a college professor, but I grew up in Winona, and I was raised Catholic. We went to Cathedral of the Sacred Heart. My family was, you know, hardcore. And what I remember about growing up in the late 60s and through the mid to late 70s is the promise of Vatican II unleashed this burst of energy and brightness and light, and the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement all drew Catholics into activism. So, I mean, today, you know, we often associate Catholicism with kind of a retrograde conservatism that, you know, Pope Francis is, you know, once more coming back to first principles. You know, we need to serve the people who are in need and not be sorting people into categories that we condemn and the like. But the Winona area, you know, with the Christian brothers up at St. Mary's, Brother Michael Hassing, Brother Gregory Hamsis opened the New Way, which was on a house on Main Street that was part of the campus that Winona State had bought, was going to expand into, in the meantime, had this space. And that, they were doing outreach to young people that, kind of street ministry, after school, help with homework, pastoral counseling, with the Tao Center at St. Teresa's, a lot of really politically engaged nuns that were part of this. Wisco, Jaeger Valley, Famine Foods Co-op. There was just, the Tao Center, I was explaining just a little bit ago, was where the meetings were held that helped get Famine Foods off the ground. Famine Foods Co-op started in that Tao, the New Way Center on campus. So the Catholic left organized anti-draft workshops in town. I remember as a high school student going up to St. Mary's and getting put through a kind of a mock CO trial that would go on here at the county level with the selective service. If you did not want to serve because of conscience, you couldn't just show up and tell them that. You had to be prepared philosophically to ground your pacifism in something more than just, I don't want to go to Vietnam. So there was just this larger thing that's so difficult to get at, because we can talk about the individuals here, but there was something greater than that, including people that weren't overtly religious, but were part of, you used the word, this counterculture.
Right.
And it was starting all kinds of new enterprises. There was the sense that, we were going to knock out these old institutions that had led us into racism, led us into warfare, led us into accumulating this huge nuclear weaponry that could only be used. Mutually assured destruction. What is that? And so I just wanted to comment here about this larger thing that Dan was, plugged into. He was one of the spark plugs for this operation. It was so much bigger than any one party.
I love that spark plug. That's that is great.
He was an instigator.
Yes, he was. He was. He made things happen. Yeah. You remind me too that he was very involved in ecumenism long before that word was being talked about. He was always part of the various churches in Austin and meeting with them and the pastors or whoever was, very, very much so. And I think instigating some of the